If you're interested in witchcraft or magic, you've probably come across the terms Book of Shadows and Grimoire. But what makes these magical books distinct? How are they different? And should you create one of your own? Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. So let's jump right into it. We're going to start with the Book of Shadows, which is a much more recent term. You've probably seen examples of books of shadows in pop culture references such as in Charmed or in Practical Magic. In a nutshell, a Book of Shadows is like a journal where you keep information about your spiritual practice. This could include spells, rituals, herb correspondences, or really anything that is focused around magic. So where did the term Book of Shadows come from? The first thing to understand about a Book of Shadows is that it's a neo-pagan term that started to be used when the religion of Wicca was created by Gerald Gardner. So it is not a term that was historically used by witches and magicians before the 1940s. Back when Wicca was predominantly organized by covens, each coven would have a communal book of shadows that contained the coven's specific spells and rituals. Over time, Wicca has evolved and changed considerably, and now there are more solitary Wiccans than Wiccans that belong to a coven. So now individual witches are encouraged to make their own books of shadows, and there aren't any formal instructions on what should or should not be included in your book. It's entirely based on what you would like to include, though there is plenty of advice online if you would like some inspiration on what to add. So, should you create your own Book of Shadows? Well, creating your own magical book and calling it a Book of Shadows is a great idea if you are Wiccan. After all, the term Book of Shadows was created by the founder of Wicca. But what if you're not Wiccan? Perhaps you're a traditional witch, or maybe you are just a pagan that wants to write about their spiritual practice. If this applies to you, then I think it's totally fine to create your own magical text, but I probably wouldn't call it a Book of Shadows. So what else could you call it? Well, that brings us to So what is a grimoire and how is it different than a Book of Shadows? Well, they actually have a lot in common, as both a grimoire and a Book of Shadows can contain things like spells and rituals. However, we've already established that a Book of Shadows is a Wiccan term, so a grimoire, by contrast, would be a magical book that is not associated with Wicca or Wiccan beliefs. While the term Book of Shadows was created in the 1940s, the word grimoire goes back way further. The term grimoire originates from the French word grimoire, which simply means a book written in Latin. By the 18th century, this word grimoire started to be used to refer to historical books of magic. And what are historical books of magic? Well, there are a ton of them, and they go way back in history. The earliest known written magical text comes from ancient Mesopotamia, where incantations were inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets. Of course, the practice of writing about magic continued into ancient Egypt and later into ancient Greece and Rome. Though these ancient magical writings were not written in a codex, or what we would call a book. So could they be considered a grimoire? Well, maybe not. Most texts we would nowadays call grimoires were written starting in the medieval period and were often created by figures called ceremonial magicians. Ceremonial magicians, like the famous John Dee, were not enemies of the church like you might think. Many were wealthy individuals who experimented with the intersections between science, faith, and magic. They recorded their rituals, experiments, and findings in books that we would now consider grimoires. So when we think about the main difference between a Book of Shadows and a grimoire, in my opinion, a grimoire represents something that is more historical in nature. Most of the time, when we are interacting with a grimoire, we are studying historical magical texts and the spells, incantations, and techniques that they contain. So that begs the question, can you write your own modern grimoire? Well, I think you can, but if you choose to do so, I would structure it in a way that it contains at least some historic and ancient magical spells, techniques, and practices. Of course, this is just my own personal opinion, and you are free to do whatever you'd like. If you are interested in learning more about historic grimoires and historic magical practice, I would definitely recommend these two books. So I have Grimoires, A History of Magic Books by Owen Davies, and the Book of Magic from Antiquity to the Enlightenment. I'll leave the links for these two books down below in the description box. So I really hope you enjoyed this introduction to the Grimoire and the Book of Shadows. If you did, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. And if you'd like to support my goal of creating free and educational content about witchcraft and paganism, you can join my Patreon community. I'll leave that link down below. And thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye.